Nobody anticipated that when an older woman entered a posh restaurant, her subdued demeanor would reveal a startling reality and stop the room in its tracks. The expansive glass windows of Portland, Oregon's famous fine dining establishment, Urban Flavors Cafe, were bathed in a warm glow from the late afternoon sun. There were soft murmurs in the air inside. The sound of glasses clinking and the gentle notes of a live pianist in the corner. The type of establishment where guests gathered to toast life's small victories or seal profitable business transactions amidst the elegant furnishings and well-tailored suits. The front door opened to show an old black female despite the years inscribed on her body. She walked slowly yet deliberately, wearing clothes that a small black handbag tucked safely under her arm, a navy blue coat with lovely embroidery at the cuffs, and a composed face that attracted attention despite her quiet authority. With a smile that seemed slightly forced but present, the hostess welcomed her. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, looking over her shoulder for a moment to make sure she wasn't holding up the line. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Margaret," the woman said in a steady, polite voice, looked over the list, nodded, and guided her to a table hidden in a corner next to the kitchen. The best seat in the house, but Mrs. Margaret didn't gripe. She took her seat, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the menu, but something wasn't quite right. A few moments later, the waiter assigned her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Jemmy, passed her table several times without even looking at her. When he finally came, his smile was thin and his tone carried an edge. "Sorry for the wait," he said briskly. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Margaret nodded elegantly. I thanked him in a more informal manner across from the younger tables. Diners who were dressed appeared to be getting prompt, courteous service. She saw the sidelong glances as a woman muttered something to her partner 2 tables away, both of them stealing glances at her. Another diner scowled, as though attempting to figure out why she didn't belong. The minutes seemed to drag on forever. Jemmy came back, but he wasn't much friendlier. "We're a little understaffed today, so it might take some time before I can respond to you," Mrs. Margaret added. "Take your time," with her lips squeezed into a faint smile. Revealing little of the annoyance she might have experienced, she wasn't planning to cause a commotion, but the unease in the air was noticeable. But as she was settling back into her chair, seemingly unconcerned, someone from across the room noticed everything, and their expression darkened. Mrs. Margaret watched the room calmly. This wasn't the first time she had experienced this kind of subtle treatment, which wasn't loud or overt, but had a way of showing itself in every dismissive glance and delayed service. She stayed poised, her hands resting gently on the table, as though she were just passing the time, while Jemmy busied himself with nearby tables, his tone upbeat. And he grinned naturally while taking orders and joking with other customers when the other diners started to become uneasy as they passed her table once more without even acknowledging her. A young couple near the center of the room exchanged anxious looks, and the woman whispered something that was barely audible over the background music. Her partner shrugged and glanced at Jemmy, who appeared to be completely unconcerned. The minutes passed, and although Mrs. Margaret maintained her composed demeanor, a small part of her wondered how far this would go. She reached for her water glass, but even that had been left empty. A waiter brought a fresh glass of wine to a client who had come in a long time after her at last. Jemmy came back. He stopped momentarily as he passed, carrying a tray of food that was going to another table. Mrs. Margaret hadn't made up her mind yet, so he asked in a tone that was almost dismissive, as if she were to blame for the delay. She looked up at him, her eyes steady and kind, but with a calm intensity that caused him to change his mind. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment." Her tone was measured and courteous as she spoke. Although Jemmy bowed and muttered something as he left, someone else had been observing intently from a table next to the bar, a man in his, wearing a clean navy blazer, sitting with a half-empty glass of sparkling water in his late 30s. His manner was composed yet acerbic. He was silent for the moment, his eyes narrowing as he watched Jemmy's behavior. He had been silently recording every interaction, every slight, every dismissive glance, and his fingers tapping lightly on the table as his expression grew colder with each minute that went by. He wasn't just any diner. He was the owner of the restaurant, and Mrs. Margaret wasn't just any patron. She was his mother. However, he wasn't ready to intervene just yet. He wanted to see how Jemmy would treat someone he assumed was. His jaw tensed helplessly as Jemmy giggled at a different table, unaware of the storm that was building across the tension in the room was increasing, and even though Mrs. Margaret stayed composed, the atmosphere in the restaurant became heavier by the moment. Eventually, something had to give, and it was only a matter of time. Ezra Margaret leaned back in his chair, his fingers continuing to tap the edge of the table in a rhythmic manner. Having worked in the restaurant business for years, he knew that patience was frequently the most effective weapon in his arsenal, but witnessing his mother suffer the subtle but intentional abuse filled him with. A gradual burning Ezra had dedicated his entire life to constructing Pemberton's Beach. It was more than simply a commercial venture. It felt personal to see her treated as though she didn't belong in a place he had created. He observed how Jemmy avoided her table and how he smiled at other guests without effort, his expression hardening whenever he glanced her way. It was a testament to the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, and fairness. She had been his compass through years of struggle, the voice in his ear telling him to keep going when the odds were stacked against him. Ezra noticed the slight smile. As if sharing, Jemmy offered another server. An unspoken joke, he tightened his hold on his glass. He took pride in every aspect of the business, his mark was on everything from a menu to the decor, but he felt helpless right now, since his mother was the one person in the world he would ever permit to be treated disrespectfully, and she was doing it with grace. He wasn't sure he could master himself. Ezra debated whether to confront Jemmy right now and humiliate him in front of the restaurant's patrons, or to wait and let the situation play out so that there would be no space for excuses later. He decided on the latter and gestured to the manager, a middle-aged lady named Ale, who cautiously walked up to his table, nodded toward his and muttered, "Keep an eye on table 12. Donna paused but nodded, knowing well then to challenge Ezra when his tone was that forceful. "Mother, I want to see how Jemmy handles this. Don't intervene." Ezra's attention went back to his mother, who was now watching him and her calm, deliberate movements. He knew that she had never been the type to complain because she believed that deeds spoke louder than words, but Ezra also believed that Jemmy would soon see the results of his actions, and the tension in the restaurant had become too much to ignore. Conversations had slowed down, and more patrons were glancing at Mrs. Margaret Jemmy without appearing to notice. Or maybe encouraged as he walked past her table once more, she lifted her hand courteously and murmured, "Excuse me," in a quiet voice that cut through the mutterings surrounding her. Jemmy paused, his expression tightening impatiently, and he spoke curtly, scarcely concealing his annoyance. Maintaining her dignity, she said, "If you're not too busy, I'd like to place my order now." Jemmy sighed loudly, looking about as though to find a way out. "I'll be back in a minute," he said, moving away before she could react. Ezra got up from his chair, moving slowly and deliberately as the room appeared to change as he traversed. Just as the waiter was making jokes with another table, he arrived at Jemmy with his imposing presence and no words. When he saw Ezra standing next to him, the casual arrogance on his face instantly turned to bewilderment. Jemmy stumbled as he tried to smile. "Ezra." The color drained from Jemmy's face as he looked toward Mrs. Margaret, who was now sitting upright with her serene gaze locked, and he said, "I didn't know you were here." "I've been here." Ezra's voice carried an unmistakable authority, and I've been watching Jemmy's smile change as his eyes darted toward his mother's table and back to Jemmy, watching you ignore my mother, who has been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without even a glass of water. During the conversation, you are your mother. Jemmy's voice trailed off. Yes, my mother. I'm cracking. The restaurant went silent, and everyone's attention was now on the event. As Ezra said, the woman you've treated like an inconvenience, the woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect you've been showering on every other table in this room. The pianist had paused in the middle of a note, his fingers lingering on the keys. Jemmy started to say something, but Ezra interrupted him, saying, "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." Ezra turned to face the manager, who had been standing close to the bar, uncertain about whether to step in. "Take over table 12, and make sure my mother has everything she needs," he said steadily. Right away, after giving a short nod, Ale hurried over to Mrs. Margaret's table and apologized profusely while she brought her a menu and filled her water glass. With an unreadable expression, Ezra turned back to face Jemmy. "We'll talk about your future here later, but for now, you're done for the day and should go home." For a few period, Jemmy stood frozen, his face displaying a mixture of shame and sadness. Then, without saying anything, he untied his apron and left the restaurant, the heavy door swinging shut behind him. After a moment of stillness, Ezra moved closer to his mother's table and knelt down a little too. He replied quietly, "You okay, Mom?" as his stern manner softened into something softer. Mrs. Margaret grinned and reached for Pat's hand, saying, "I'm fine, son. You handled that well." Ezra released the tension in his shoulders, and she said, "I should have intervened sooner. But no, you let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." However, as the restaurant resumed its normal bustle, it became evident that no one would forget what had just happened, occurred, or the lesson it imparted. The ambience at Pemberton's bar tower had changed, and discussions resumed. However, the atmosphere was heavier, and more considerate patrons who had seen the action now gazed at Mrs. Margaret with a mix of silent admiration and respect. While Ale, the manager, made sure Mrs. Margaret's meal was served promptly, she personally presented the dishes with an apology so heartfelt that it felt like she was trying to undo the actions of the entire evening. Mrs. Margaret accepted the apology with her customary grace, giving a slight nod before turning her attention to other things. Ezra returned to his table, his face still composed, though the anger that had been building in his eyes hadn't completely subsided. She didn't want ostentatious gestures or speeches to appreciate the food. Her quiet dignity spoke for itself. A young couple who had been watching the entire event leaned toward one another at a different table. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman said, shaking her head and whispering. "It makes you think about how often this happens, and no one says anything." Her partner nodded thoughtfully. "It's not just about what you see. It's about what you're willing to stand up against when it happens." As he passed their table on his way back to his mother, Ezra heard their conversation, and what they said stuck with him. He reflected on the innumerable instances in which individuals, such as Jemmy, had escaped punishment. Abuse just because no one had been paying attention or concerned enough to step in. When Ezra sat down next to his mother, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You've created something lovely, Ezra." "I know, Mom," she added quietly. "But keep in mind that a place like this is about more than just the cuisine or ambience. It's about how people feel when they enter." Ezra answered in a regretful tone. She shook her head and said, "I let you down tonight. You handled it with integrity and gave everyone an opportunity to see the truth, and that's what's important to them." The employees appeared to. More careful servicing, being more considerate, wasn't only about preventing another tragedy. It was also about the unspoken lesson. As Mrs. Margaret finished her meal, she looked around the room, her gaze briefly settling on Ale, who gave her a small, apologetic smile. Her expression was one of quiet satisfaction that the moment had left an impression. But for Ezra, the lesson wasn't just for Jemmy or the staff. It was also a reminder that leadership wasn't just about managing operations. It was about upholding the values that made his restaurant a place worth visiting. As the evening came to a close, Mrs. Margaret prepared. To maintain her composed manner, Ezra led her to the door and held it open while she emerged into. For a little minute, they stood together in the cool evening air, their faces lit by the restaurant's windows. "You did good, son," she remarked, her voice containing a warmth that eased the strain of the day. Ezra gave a tiny grin. She put a hand on his arm and said, "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's the real change." He nodded as she walked to the car, waiting by the curb, and then got in, turning around and giving him one last chance. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." The personnel at the restaurant worked quietly to resolve the earlier event, which was still fresh in their memories. Ale called a quick team meeting and spoke in a stern yet helpful manner. "Tonight's events are a wake-up call because she started talking about the culture we're fostering here and how we treat our visitors. Everyone who enters should be treated with respect no matter what." The employees nodded, their faces gloomy. Jemmy's absence served as a stark reminder of what occurs when professionalism is replaced by prejudice. The evening's events weighed heavily on Ezra as he made his way back inside and looked around the empty dining room, but they also reinforced his resolve to make Burton more than just a restaurant. It had to be a location where the best meals were provided to the visitors who had observed it, coupled with decency and friendliness. They had come for a fine meal, but they left with a story that made them realize the value of respect, the necessity of speaking up, and the silent strength of people who refuse to let injustice define them. As you watch, consider what you would have done in that situation. Would you have spoken up, or would you have stood by and allowed it to happen? These moments aren't always evident, but they happen everywhere. Let tonight's story serve as a reminder to always choose empathy and dignity, even if it didn't move you. Remember to share and subscribe, since it's through these discussions that we develop as a team.